You to please switch off your cell phones or please turn them to silent mode during the course of this session. This session is going to last for 1 hour. It will include a Q&A, which is going to be part of this hour. The moderator is Dr. Murad Musa Khan. Dr. Murad Musa Khan is Professor of Psychiatry at the Aga Khan University, Karachi. His research interests range from socio-cultural factors in suicidal behavioralism, mental health of women and the elderly, psychosomatic medicine, and ethics in medical practice. I hand the session over to Dr. Murad.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to welcome you to this session. We are in tough competition. Pakistan's first Oscar nominee, Sharmeen Obaid Chinoy, is holding a parallel session in the theater. So if any one of you is interested in going there, please do so now. But if you don't, and if you want to stay here, I promise you'll have a very, very interesting session here. Just give you a brief background to this, and I think there is no one in Pakistan living today who has not been affected by what is going around us since that fateful day in September 2001 in New York. In many countries, almost all of them in the Muslim world, have been subjected to traumas and upheaval of immense proportions. More than 1 million have been killed in Iraq, countless thousands in Afghanistan, thousands in Libya, many others in Egypt, Yemen, Kashmir, Palestine, and Syria, some of them directly as a result of 9/11, but others not so directly. In Pakistan, officially, more than 40,000 people have been killed due to acts of terrorism. And I suspect this is a grossly underestimated figure because many people who have been injured die later, and official figures are always underestimated than the actual figures. But beyond the numbers, and this is very important because the message gets lost often, there are survivors with horrific injuries, amputated limbs, loss of sight, brain damage, incontinent, who have to spend the rest of their lives disabled. And it is not just them, but and the families. And the psychological traumas, the psychological scars of these acts can linger on for years and decades and through generations. This is what is lost in the narrative of the war, the so-called fog of war. So, what are the psychological effects of terrorism, of insurgencies and war? What are the psychological effects on children? I don't know how many of you are from Karachi, but about 3-4 months ago, less than a mile from here, huge car bomb went off in a road which was full of schools. Many schools had been closed for weeks, and children have been traumatized, affected. Many of them have had nightmares. Many of them have ended up in our clinics. So what are the effects of these? What are the effects when leaders in Washington and Tel Aviv and London and in Islamabad and New Delhi take decisions to go to war? Do they ever consider the effect it will have on the population? Psychological trauma. And what can we do about it? How can we as professionals mitigate the effect of the wars, the acts of terrorism and so on? And how can we inform policy? So these are some of the challenges and some of the questions that I hope our eminent and distinguished panel will address and try and answer. I'm going to introduce the panel that we have assembled here. On my immediate left is Dr. Sarmila Bose. She is a Senior Research Associate at the Department of Politics and International Relations at the University of Oxford. Dr. Bose has a PhD in Political Economy from the Harvard University. He combines academics and journalism in her professional life, and her book, Dead Reckoning, Memories of the 1971 Bangladesh War, has just been published by OUP. I bought it yesterday. I am still on the first chapter, and I can tell you it's riveting. So I'd greatly encourage any of you who wants to understand what happened to read the book. Next to Dr. Bose is Brigadier Maudit Rana. Dr. Rana is a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists of the UK. He is a serving army officer. He is an army psychiatrist, so he's really on the front line. He is commanding the Armed Forces Institute of Mental Health in Rawalpindi. He's advisor and professor of psychiatry and Director General of NUST, which is the National University of Science and Technology, Center for Trauma Research there. He has more than 40 publications, 7 books, and 3 book chapters. Next to Dr. Rana is Dr. Unaiza Niaz. Dr. Unaiza Niaz is also a fellow of the Royal College of Psychiatrists of the UK, and she did her postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins Institute in US. He is a visiting professor at the University of Health Sciences in Lahore and the director of Psychiatric Clinic and Stress Research Center here in Karachi. She chairs the section of women's mental health in the World Psychiatric Association. She has numerous research articles, several books, and her focus and her line of interest is women's mental health and the post-trauma psychological issues and effects and the management. She's done a lot of work in the post-earthquake disaster in Pakistan with colleagues, and her book on which this session is organized around which is called Wars, Insurgencies and Terrorist Attacks, a Psychological Perspective on the Muslim World, also published by OUP. Last but not the least is Dr. Faria Paracha. Dr. Faria Paracha has a master's from the University of Calgary in Canada and a PhD from the University of London. He's a clinical neuropsychologist based in Lahore. I met Dr. Paracha just a few months ago. I had not heard of her. I think it's probably been about 6 months or maybe 9 months. And the work she's doing, and I hope she shares some of that with us today, is truly remarkable. When we hear about suicide bombers, young men who blow themselves up, I can tell you there are at least 100 or 200 or 500 primed to blow themselves up at any time. Dr. Paracha is involved in a program of de-radicalizing these young men. Because when the army did an operation in Swat and they found these young men who had been primed to act as suicide bombers, they didn't know what to do. So they approached Dr. Paracha, and she's been running this program of how to de-radicalize them and to reintegrate them back into the community. It's a remarkable project, which I think not just Pakistanis, but the whole world who's worried about terrorism from the Muslim world ought to take notice and ought to support. So with that introduction, I'd like to ask each one of the panelists to give a brief view of their own work and on the topic. We'll go in turn. I would like them to stick to time of 8 to 10 minutes. I'll give a little reminder at 8 minutes and I'll then shut off the mic at 10 minutes. No, I won't do that. And then we'll open the floor to question and answers. So can I request our first speaker, Dr. Brigadier Muaddat Rana, to please give his views on this. Rana.
I think it's, I hope people right at the back can hear me. Can you? Right. Thank you, Murad. Thank you very much for introducing that topics so eloquently. I think foremost we need to congratulate Oxford University Press for publishing this wonderful book that the title of you can see right there, and you will hear more about it from Dr. Unaiza herself. Each one of you is strongly recommended to go through this book if you really want to read a heartwarming experience of what it is to be a Muslim in the modern world. What does it really feel? And I think the book clearly shows to the world how to see this whole concept of wars, insurgencies and terrorism from a Muslim perspective. I've had the unique opportunity, I wouldn't say good luck, but definitely an opportunity to look at the war on terror, the insurgencies that have been going on since 2001, and the acts of terrorism from very close quarters, I must confess. And in the process, on numerous occasions, one felt extremely cheated, one felt hurt, one felt, is it really worth being a human being? So your own basic themes of life are grossly challenged when you come across people who are ready to blow themselves up. And one has had an interaction with some of these people. Each time that one has interacted with some of these people, one was reminded of Charles Dickens' immortal lines, and I think this is 200 years of Charles Dickens as well. So when Charles Dickens said it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, in Tale of Two Cities, I believe, that he opened that novel with these lines. I think he was very right. He was describing our times very much so when he was describing Britain and Paris or France of those times. It is in fact the best of the times for some and worst of the times for others. It is certainly a spring of hope for some and a winter of despair for others. And as you would hear subsequently from Dr. Paracha, that how much of war, insurgency and terrorism is rooted into poverty, how much of it is rooted into economic factors more than anything else. As the world would like to believe, it's all about Islam and Islamic terrorists and all the rest of it. And I can assure you that I've seen it from close quarters. Nothing to do with Islam. It's nothing to do with Pakistan. It's to do with some very unfortunate people, very miserable people, very misled people. And they've had no choice but to succumb to that pressure that they eventually did succumb to. I mean, if you really go back, I believe it was 1973 when Konrad Lorenz, once a Nazi, subsequently a Nobel laureate, came out and said that man is probably the most ferocious animal that has ever walked this planet. And he said in that book, probably Man's 8 Deadly Sins, I believe, was the name of the book. And he said that man, when he decides to destroy his own kind in cold blood, he actually uses 3 ploys to do it. And those ploys are exactly the ones written there. This is what he does when he wants to destroy his own kind: wars, insurgencies, and terrorist attacks. Now, what does he do by doing so, psychologically speaking? Well, physical destruction is only one part of it. The other thing that terrorism and insurgencies do to you psychologically is it instills dread and fear into you. And if it was only fear and dread, it would have been fine, because human beings have this system in their body by which they can deal with fear. But it doesn't stop there. It actually takes you further psychologically into a state of hopelessness and helplessness. And this is the part that human body doesn't have a method to deal with. This hopelessness and helplessness that terrorism pushes you into. And only if it had stopped there. No, it doesn't. Actually, it goes a step further. And it takes away your creativity. It isolates you completely from the rest of the world. And from your own kiths and kins. If you see a community that has been hit by terrorism, you will find people looking away from each other. They don't talk to each other. They don't share their feelings anymore. And that's how it is very different from grief. You know, if somebody, a loved one of mine, God forbid, dies, you will all converge to me, you'll hold my hand, you'll talk to me. But if, Khuda na khasta, we were part of an insurgency or a terrorist attack, we would stop talking to each other. We will become so cold and indifferent to each other. And that's a dreadful state for a society to be in. And then, not only that it stops your creativity, it obstructs your creativity, it goes on to reduce your productivity. And living in a third world country with limited resources, once your productivity starts to go down, you then obviously go on to a slide which is of a one which generates a vicious cycle. Remember, all this started, as I said, rooted in poverty. So once the downward slide starts at a social level in terms of economics, that is when it starts to feed itself on generating more terrorism and completes a terrible, terrible vicious cycle. Now, another part that I have seen over the years that I'd like to share with you is that the societal institutions slowly but surely become agents of the terrorism, if I may use the word, in inverted commas. Now, how does that happen? Now, what does basically the terrorist wants? It wants to shake your belief in the society and societal institutions. So what society starts to do in response to terrorism is to come up with great idealistic laws and regulations. And those laws and regulations and those responses of the society are so self-destructive, so self-limiting, so obstructive. They would block the roads, they would search through right, left and center. Coming to Carlton is an ordeal, as all of you would have, and that's exactly what the terrorist wants. That you start to challenge and argue with each other and say, which society are we living in? Why are we living here? So by the time actually you go through a road, you've decided, I want to leave this country. Hooray, says the terrorist, I've done it. Because he has shaken your confidence in your country. It has shaken the confidence, your confidence in your own institutions. And that's exactly what he wanted to do. Now, another aspect that I would like to draw your attention to, and that is that this is terrorism magnified, heroic by certain people in their terms and words. They would like to tell you that these are sufferers and these people have been undermined for long periods of time. They've been bombed, etc., etc., etc. Well, let me tell you that those people who are actually bombed and who go through the war and its effects are the last ones to become one as regards terrorists. It's a completely different set of people who probably have nothing to do with it, who just pick individuals like the ones that Dr. Racha is dealing with and try and turn them into their tools, into making them human bombs. So it's a very big game. The other aspect that I would like to draw your attention to is that this is terrorism, war and insurgencies with big T, with big W and with big I. But there is a small t terrorism and there's a small W war and there's a small I insurgency. And that happens in each home of this country. Please don't kill me if I tell you that there's a little terrorist sitting in each one of us. Look at our behavior with each other in our own homes. Look at the way that we deal with our women. Look at the way we deal with our children. Look at the way we deal with the disabled. Look at the way we deal with our oldies in our own homes. And you will many a times see terrorism with small t. There are a lot of husbands who are shaking their heads. Amazing. In our own relationships, we instill fear, we instill hopelessness, we instill despair in our own relationships, in our own homes. So many a times, when as a psychiatrist I sit on the right side of the table and listen to people, stories of their homes, I feel they're talking about Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And everything that you read about in the newspapers is happening in that home at a micro level. So I think it's extremely important to understand that if you want to win the war against terrorism, remember us saying that you cannot win a war against an enemy whose outposts are in your head. You cannot win that war. And therefore, each one of you need to review your software and ask yourself every day, am I indulging into some kind of a terrorism at a micro level? Have I waged a war or a battle against somebody close to me in my own life? Have I created an insurgency around myself, for my children, for my wife, for my folks, for my friends? I think that's a question that you need to ask. And by changing that software from within, I think you will start a movement by which the terrorist will find no support in this country. But today I can tell you that if you bring up this topic of terrorism, there will be many people who would stand up and argue with you. There will be many people who will try and justify that act. And I have actually seen it as an army person sitting in a family, Murad, where 3 or 4 people came into this very senior army officer who had lost his son. in a terrorist attack in Rawalpindi. And they came in and they said, and listen to this, they said, "Bada afsos hua." I'll translate it for you. You understand it? "Bada afsos hua, आपका बेटा चला गया, लेकिन आपके अब्बा, आपके मियाँ ने भी तो बड़े लड़कों को मारा है." ये अफसोस कर रहे हैं वो. So I thought those 3 or 4 people sitting there were definitely warmongers and terrorists themselves, because they don't even know how to share somebody's grief. So I think, ladies and gentlemen, my appeal to you is that if you want to really change this country for good and forever, start at your own level. Start from within and kill the terrorist within you first. Break that warrior and its strengths from within. And stop that insurgent from within, first of all. And then from that day onwards, you will never support a terrorist. You will never support a warmonger. And you will never support an insurgent. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rana. That was quite an eye-opener. I'd like to now request Dr. Unaiza Niaz to give her views on this, please.
Thank you, Miran. I'm very honored and delighted to be the guest speaker in this particular session, and that it's based on my book. I am very, in fact, most of my work is actually done by Brigadier Muwaddat Rana, who's been always a good brother. He's done my job most eloquently, and I don't have to talk about this book. So let me just briefly say that we know that not only these wars and insurgencies, etc., result in high mortality rate, but in a tremendous psychosocial impact. And the psychological perspectives are mostly ignored, as they are not generally visible or unnoticed in the early stages. The traumatic events are shocking and emotionally overwhelming situations to deal with. And these are the basic facts which most of the people don't know. Most often, trauma is accompanied by many losses. Unfortunately, such traumatic events are quite common in Pakistan, as already mentioned. Relentless in occupied territories of Kashmir, Palestine, and other Muslim countries. And as I just said, I just wanted to mention briefly, and because Dr. Murad Musa mentioned, what should psychiatrists and what we as mental health professionals as general can do to help the sufferers of these wars, insurgencies and terrorist attacks. So before I start, I'd like to talk about Gaza, which I just visited last week. I was the first Pakistani with the green passport to go there, and of all the people, Pakistani Muslim woman psychiatrist. It was the most moving, memorable, enlightening visit to this idyllic, apparently peaceful, tranquil, serene and rather heavenly coast strip of Gaza on the magnificent Mediterranean Sea. Believe me, it's a heaven on this earth. This, of course, is the biggest open prison. This is me. Never been so contented and happy and peaceful. This is the beach. You can see the ruins around. This is a guy who is from Saudi Arabia, who was badly treated as a Palestinian, who came back to Gaza to be there as a Palestinian, lift his head high up and fight for the struggle. These are the children in the school in Palestine, and these are the boys on the beach. Not like our beach, where we go and we are harassed, we are robbed, we are killed. This was a peaceful place, and this is Gaza, for God's sake. आगे नहीं जा रहा, फिर बंद हो गया. जी. आगे और आगे. आगे जी. Now the Gaza Community Mental Health Program is the most interesting program, and I think in some ways gave me a lot of inspiration that we can do something about these problems, particularly in our world, in Pakistan. This was founded by Dr. Iyad Al-Siraj in 1990, who has integrated medicine, psychiatry and human rights. Now to just recite few lines from Murid al-Barghouti, who's a Palestinian poet. It is fine to have an undustful death, no holes in our shirts and no evidence in our ribs. It is fine to die with a white pillow, not the pavement under our cheeks, or hands resting in those of our loved ones, surrounded by desperate doctors and nurses, with nothing left but a graceful farewell, paying no attention to history, leaving this world as it is, hoping that someday someone else will change it. This is the reality of Gaza's existence, and Gaza Community Mental Health Program is giving hope, sustenance, and strength to the people to face life and continue their struggles for liberation. The most inspiring thing about Palestine, especially Gaza, is that they relentlessly continue their struggles for the liberation of the territories. And I do wish there will be an Ali or Umar Farooq or Hussein to liberate the territories, or somebody. Now, Gaza Community Mental Health Program is as I said, brainchild of Iyad al-Sarraj, who is a psychiatrist, a human rights activist, primarily a visionary, and above all, a citizen of Gaza. Iyad is a symbol of unity and diversity of interest, like Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, or any other leader in the world. Now, I'm challenging all the psychiatrists of Pakistan. Please do something. He believes that we all are the citizens of the world, and the definition of the citizen of the world is where all are equal, living in peace, security, and above all, respected. Word is respect. Gaza Community Mental Health Program made me think that we in Pakistan must have a comprehensive community mental health program as well. But considering a large country, diversity due to multiple factors, ethnicity, religious sects, etc., and the emphasis laid by the interested groups on diversity, rather than unity of purpose and a common vision, it would be a difficult task to develop a program as GCMHP, but I think a beginning has to be made. Now, my book, as I said, besides the other things that Brigadier Rana has mentioned, it also illustrates how psychiatrists go through the painful journey with the traumatized patients towards recovery and development of resilience. And I think Muwaddat Rana is one who's actually experienced it in practical life, day in and day out, and most of us quite a few times. Even in Karachi as a psychiatrist and working in private practice, I see it every day. Important areas of physical and psychological health are affected by positive traits as psychological resilience and positive emotional granularity. Now, I feel it's very, very important that the civil society in all Muslim countries should have a dialogue among themselves and the world powers. Appeal to all the humanitarian world organizations to be aware of these disastrous consequences affecting the psyche of innocent civilians. And I hope that this book, which I hope you will read if you haven't read, will create an awareness and portray the psychosocial suffering of innocent civilians in the Muslim world. Dr. Rana has mentioned generally about people who've been through these bombings, etc. But he hasn't actually mentioned the women and children. Believe me, the silent sufferers, the vulnerable groups, the women and children, what they go through, please read in the book. I cannot begin to talk about it. And I've had sleepless nights, and there were times when my iman was affected. Why God is trying human beings like this? But later on, I came back to what I think. I got my iman back, but it did shake me so much to that extent. The pain and suffering of these women and children is, it's unbelievable. I can't put into words. So this book is my sweat and blood, and please read the vulnerable groups chapter. Now, other thing is that perhaps by all these publications and or presentations at different forums, perhaps there's a window of understanding human solutions and ethical resolution of conflicts in the Muslim world. And hopefully these sort of publications will strengthen the UN resolutions which are passed but not implemented. I think dialogue, discourses, and publications are extremely pertinent to promote peace, human rights, and conflict resolution in the warring and conflict regions of the world. And I think we psychiatrists, especially in the Muslim world, or in South Asia, or the places where these wars are going on, we have a special duty to use our expertise or experiences and put it in front of public so that they know and the people who are making decisions in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naza, and I hope you will share this wonderful trip that you had to Gaza with us in a more detailed format. I'd like to call upon Dr. Faria Peracha now to please tell us about the work she's doing, and also generally to perhaps address the issue of prevention of terrorism and war, and how do we prevent these young men from falling into this trap in the first place? Dr. Faria.
Yes, I thank you very much, Dr. Murad, for inviting me, and to the Oxford University Press. I think it's an opportunity that I have certainly learned a lot today from the works that were presented. Brigadier Rana, thank you for helping me out already about the young boys in Sabaun. Sabaun is an academy in Swat, and it had 190 boys, and now nearly 100 boys are in the community working, studying, going to the best universities and colleges. And now in these holidays, they're helping, my social workers are monitoring them, and surprisingly, they're helping other students. They're helping other children. So that is quite something. But I would also like to just address the psychological aspects first, and then I'll come to Sabaun and some data from Sabaun. Here, the media is the conduit. And I think there have been, I'm talking about myself, maybe you had a different reaction, but public announcers, TV news personalities create the vast stage of illusion. And that has been one reaction, I think, in society about all the news on terrorism. Terrorist attacks, sometimes we just distance ourselves and it's like a spectacle that we are watching. The second reaction is of distance and withdrawing and denial. And the ability, as the news amplifies and it's repeated incessantly, we withdraw. That's the second reaction. And I'm guilty of perhaps both. But the news, the amplification of the news has served the purpose of the terrorist, because that's what they play to. They want it amplified again and again and again. So how did we all react? How did the people of Swat react, and how did we in the big cities react? People of Swat were terrified. They thought that is the only reality. Children were used to seeing heads roll down the street, and the terrorists of security forces and the terrorists urinating on them. And the kind of inhuman acts that were being conducted, I think, changed their psyche completely. But what did we do? I think they reacted to whatever was happening. We didn't. I, like most of us, was that prisoner in that cave that Plato talked about in the Republic, watching those shadows on the wall. I didn't come out. And when did I come out? When it hit Lahore. No, not even then. I think Brigadier Rana was there at that time when the first 12 children were apprehended in Mingora during the counterinsurgency. I just happened to know General Nadeem, and I got involved in profiling them. So there were these children that were on my lap. I could not ignore it. Does it take that? Did it have to be just that? I wish I had done it much earlier. In any case, that's how it happened. And then a school started, and Brigadier Rana was there when the school started, and there were 30 children, then there were 50, then there were 80, then there were 100, then there were 200. And some of them are very serious. They've killed many people. But you know something? The empathy or the response of the act is missing. It's not there. Most of these children come from very poor backgrounds. They hardly have 2 meals a day. And most of them had dropped. The general profile is they had dropped out of mainstream education. Not all had gone to madrasa. Now it's very simple to say that children from madrasas are recruited. That is not true. A mother will first try and send, a mother who has 6 to 25 children will first try and send them to school. But if a child drops out, she can't afford to feed him when he comes home. So he has to work, or he has to loiter around. Then she will send him to the madrasa. Not the first 3, it's the 4th. And I was sharing that data with Brigadier Rana the other day, that it was shocking to see that the children, most of the children are middle children of large families, and it seems that mother, because fathers are mostly working abroad, there are no jobs in Swat or in Middle East. It seems when she has a fourth child, that's a redundant child. That's infanticide. And she gives him up. So we need to work on that. We need to work on the social fabric. I mean, it's very important. Anyway, so I came out of the cave and I got involved in Sabaun, and there's no end now. Now I'm there. There can be no peace, and I think Ineza touches upon it in her book. Brigadier Rana just did it. And Scott Appleby in his book, I think, touches upon it in a very strong manner. There can be no peace without justice, and there can be no justice until we give everyone the basic human rights of food, clothing, education, health, and respect. I agree. I think we cannot shut our eyes. I just want to quote Baldwin here. People who shut their eyes to reality simply invite their own destruction. And anyone who insists on remaining in a state of innocence long after that innocence is dead turns himself into a monster. So let's open our eyes. Let's do something. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piracha. I'd like to now call upon the only non-psychologist or psychiatrist on the panel, Dr. Bose. And perhaps after listening to the other panelists and the book you've written on the 71 war and your research for that book, perhaps you could tell us what you felt were some of the narratives that came out of that book that could inform us now as we struggle now in today's Pakistan to try and control another insurgency that is going on in Balochistan, and people are talking already of the breakup of Pakistan as we know it, and there are truncated maps of Pakistan now available on the internet. So perhaps you could throw us some light on your research and how we can learn from that in the present day.
Thank you, Dr. Murad. I find myself in a very privileged position to have the benefit of the knowledge and experience of 4 psychologists and psychiatrists. And I thought I would share with you a very remarkable mass psychological phenomenon that I discovered while doing my research on the 1971 war. And it has a connection with Balochistan, which is very interesting. And for those who have read my book, it will be familiar, but perhaps many of you haven't yet had the chance. So let me tell you what it is, and I'll give you a few examples from my book. And this is what I have called the case of the imaginary friend of the Bangladeshi or Bengali nationalist in the form of the Baluch. And what happened was, and let me read you a section from my work. During my interviews in Bangladesh with eyewitnesses to many massacres and other violent incidents, a wide variety of Bangladeshis in towns and villages, men and women, in different districts with very different experiences of the conflict, mentioned Beluchis, in Bangla the word is Beluchi, as a better sort among the West Pakistanis they encountered during the conflict. Now, every small kindness shown to Bengalis was attributed to the person being a Beluchi. The published Bangladeshi reminiscences of 1971 also contain many references to humane gestures by Beluchi officers and soldiers of the Pakistan Army. Now, let me give you a few examples of this. There was one woman who was a little girl, young girl at the time, who was a witness to a massacre by a unit of the Pakistan Army in a village called Thanapara in Rajshahi district. And she related how women and children, and several others related also, but how women and children were separated from the men. The women and children were sent back to the village, and the men were executed. And several of them survived, and I have interviewed a couple of the survivors as well. Now, in spite of this terrible traumatic experience, this woman told me that she noticed that not all the soldiers were bad. Some of them looked very distressed themselves at what was happening. And she said it was the Beluchi ones who were the kinder ones. And her husband, who was a young boy at the time and narrowly escaped from being executed because he was considered too young to be in the men's group, he told me many stories, and one of them was how he had been picked up later in the year, one day, by two soldiers and made to work on building a bunker. And then an officer came by and saw that there was this child working, asked him who had brought him there, and when he pointed out the two soldiers, the officer severely reprimanded the two soldiers, gave the boy some money from his own pocket and told him to go home. And this man told me that he thought this officer was a Beluchi. Abul Barak Alvi is a freedom fighter who was a part of the Dhaka guerrilla groups. And he said that when he and his fellow prisoners of the Dhaka guerrilla groups, he was captured eventually, he escaped also, which is another interesting story. When they were being tortured and interrogated at the martial law courts of the MP hostel in Dhaka, they were given nothing to eat or drink until an older soldier brought the prisoners some bread one night. And Alvi thought the soldier was a Beluchi. A completely different example from a totally different place, Jaladhar Sengupta, who was in the Prabartak Shangho welfare organization in Chittagong. He has written that he was one of the few men left in their center in May when 5 Pakistan Army soldiers arrived there, and he and the 4 others were made to sit in the field, and they were going to be shot. And he has written in Bengali, and I have translated, 3 Beluchi soldiers left the field and went away. They said, "We will not shoot elderly unarmed people." One of the 2 remaining Punjabis shot at us. And the final example to give you today, there's an account by Pratiti Devi, the absolutely terrifying account of how soldiers burst into their house in Kumila on the night of the 29th March and took away her elderly father-in-law, the very well-known politician and legislator Dhirendranath Dotto, and her Debor, that's her younger brother-in-law, Dilip. Neither man ever returned. Now, she and her daughter were made to remain in another room during the operation, and all attempts to come out and see what was happening was prevented by what she calls a young Beluch captain who blocked their way. And Pratiti Devi has written again in Bengali, and I'm translating, "The Beluch young man stood in front of the door until the last soldier left. Later I realized that it was because of this young man that Aroma and I survived with our lives that day." Now, after a while, I was really intrigued by the appearance of so many Beluchis among the armed forces in East Pakistan in 71, because I was aware that the Beluch are very poorly represented in state institutions in Pakistan, especially the army. They are generally at the receiving end of the army. And so I asked the officers of the Pakistan Army, whom I was interviewing later on, about this, about Baluch officers and soldiers, and they told me basically that they were pretty sure there were no Baluchis at all in the army at that time in the eastern province. Now, so if there were no ethnic Baluchis of the Pakistan Army there at the time, who were these mysterious Baluchis whom the Bangladeshis were seeing everywhere? These were the men who were tempering the regime's oppression by their humane actions. Now, the logical answer is that they do not exist, except in the ethnic imagination of the Bangladeshi nationalists. Now, what the Bangladeshi nationalist movement had done was to frame the conflict completely in ethno-linguistic terms. And basically it was freedom and democracy-loving Bengalis versus colonial and oppressive Punjabis. And the word Punjabi is used for all West Pakistanis, regardless of whether people were Punjabi or not. So what happened was the issues of discrimination, representation, federalism, autonomy, it was all reduced in this articulation to sort of West versus East, and then ultimately to a shorthand of Bengali versus Punjabi. And in this, Punjabi was an unadulterated term of abuse. I mean, it stood for completely villainous people. Now, in this conceptualization, the sudden appearance of good guys among the people who have been demonized as the enemy has clearly posed a problem for the nationalists. Now, what I didn't understand, and this is, I now start my questions to the psychologists, Now, the Bengali nationalists, I thought, could have simply left it as a few exceptional humane individuals among people they call the Shala Punjabis. But instead, they appear to have invented a whole new ethnic category. Now, the choice of Balochistan may have something to do with a feeling of solidarity towards another oppressed and rebellious province. As you know, General Tikka Khan, who was sent to Bengal, was also known as the Butcher of Balochistan. Now, I also don't know how this mythical band of Baluchis took on national proportions, because all the accounts, whether the people I talked to or the accounts I read, are individual accounts. These are not people who got together one day and dreamed this up. But clearly it is so widespread that this was a national, mass psychological phenomenon. I also don't know whether this was prevalent during 1971 or whether this was something in retrospect. It could have been, because after all there was the very bloody suppression of the Baluch people later in the 1970s. Now, I only came across one officer that I was able to identify, who was there and who is mentioned in my book, who was actually from Balochistan. He was described to me by a fellow officer as a Hazara from Balochistan. And this officer, when they were surrounded and defeated in a battle in Kushtia. And when this officer was captured by the Bengali nationalists, according to the fellow officer who managed to survive, he was butchered. So the fact that he was from Balochistan actually didn't make any difference on the ground at the time. He was probably not asked where he was from. He was a Pakistan Army officer, and he was killed when he was captured, just like other officers were killed when they were captured. So ultimately, it didn't actually make a difference, and there were no Baluch there in the armed forces. And yet, this is a widespread, clearly psychological phenomenon. And it would be fascinating for me, certainly, and hopefully for all of you, if our psychologist experts could throw some light on this. Have you come across any other similar phenomenon, maybe other conflicts, when people, maybe it's a coping mechanism people have in other conflicts as well? Thank you very much.
Quick response from Dr. Paracha before we open it for questions to the floor.
I cannot resist. Thank you very much. That was very illuminating. Well, in case of Swat, they were told that this is not a Pakistani army, this is an American army, and they believed it, and that the soldiers were Hindu soldiers. Now, this is something I was wanting to say in the session on education, that if we don't start teaching logical reasoning and rational thinking to our children as soon as possible, you can beguile them into anything. And they really believed it, that they were Hindu soldiers, and they were recruited by an American army.
Just a word on that, and I think one explanation would be that all soldiers in army are divided into Baluch, FF, Frontier Force, Punjab, irrespective of their background in terms of their provincial roots. So I think what happened probably was that probably during that period of time, some of the soldiers who were wearing the Baluch regiment thing started to be picked up and blown out of proportion subsequently because of that same phenomena of identification with the Balochistan as a set of people. So what they probably did psychologically was that they picked up their comfort zone with Balochistan as another area which was being suppressed, put it on this particular word Baluch written on the shoulders of these soldiers, and they started to identify with them. And there would be some number of the same in FF and Punjab as well, which they would completely ignore, psychologically speaking.
If I can just, in fact, I thought of that. In fact, I sometimes asked the Bangladeshis that, was it the regiment? Was a particular regiment well disciplined, for example, didn't commit atrocities or something? And to them, it's not that. For them, it's a completely ethnic thing because they were from different units. But the origin may have come from that. I must say, some of the Baluch regiment officers asked me, is this a good conduct certificate for us? And I had to tell them no, because it has nothing to do with regiment. I should also mention that the second most popular were Pathans. and also quite illogically, because many of the officers, senior generals, they absolutely hated war Pathans. But, for example, in this Thanapara massacre, the village, the survivors told me that there was another unit that went to exactly a similar village a few yards down, the river. And they said that the officer, without any evidence, they didn't have evidence, they said it must be that the officer who came to our village was a Punjabi because he killed people. And the officer who had gone to the other village was a Pathan.
I think we all remember the National Awami Party of that time. National Awami Party had two parts, Bhashani group and the Ghaffar group. So, they were represented in Bangladesh other than like any other political party from West Pakistan. This was the only party that was represented. And it had leaders like Ataullah Mengal, for example, from Balochistan, and certain leaders from NWFP. So there was this clear divide that you mentioned of the type that you're alluding to.
Thank you very much. I see a positive aspect on what you've just related, Dr. Bose, that despite the evilness that exists in human beings, they always few good men. We've seen this phenomena in Vietnam, we've seen this in the two world wars, and I think we've seen this in the Bangladesh war as well. So I think it is encouraging that human beings, where they can go to extreme depths of depravity and inhuman behavior to other human beings, they're also people who will go out and sacrifice and save other human beings. We don't have too much time left, but I'd like to open the floor for question and answers from the audience. So please raise your hands. And I'd like to please make a request to identify yourself, keep your questions short, no long speeches, and keep it focused. Okay. Can you take it to the lady in the blue dress over there first, please? And then to the gentleman next to her, and then one at the back.
Whatever and wherever children are, whatever and wherever children are facing wars, and whenever they talk about pistols and bombs and everything, because they are watching so many things around them. And in Karachi, I studied, they are very much worried. They are, children are saying, why we are going to church or masjid, there will be bomb. So how we are preparing our children and giving peace to them?
Next gentleman, next to you, please. We'll take a few questions and then try and answer them collectively.
My question is Sharmila Bose. Madam, you mentioned here in your book as just a part of building the sympathy of the Baloch is very, very near to the Bengalis freedom fighter. But the free freedom fighter is concerned about the one angle. One is free freedom fighter, and other side is the separatists. As you are mentioned here in Bengali, just the Rana Sahib is mentioned is though no discrimination of the Bengali or Baloch and is there. The Baloch regiment is just the shoulder and identification of the many ethnic group of in this. And second question is what is going on in the Balochistan. It is only destabilized the country and power shortage, gas shortage, just the bigger resources in Balochistan and full and rich of minerals.
Thank you. Please question, please.
What are your sympathy that the connection of the Baloch people is? Yes.
Okay.
And the second question is just the.
Thank you. All right. Can you take it to the gentleman with the black shirt at the back?
Just welcome. Actually, like my question is.
Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Dr. Jawad Shamsi. My question is, we have seen so much like differences in terms of, you can see there are people who are fighting for their rights and people who are fighting for their freedom. So, how do you define the word terrorism? Because this is a concern. Where is the boundary line for terrorism and freedom fighter and stuff like that? And my second question is, do you think that media is doing its job? Because if you open the TV, you will find these Mamogate scandals and all these kind of issues, but we are not focusing on our basic issues. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. The gentleman over there, can you just stand up, please?
This is Rafiq Sheikh. I totally agree with the speakers, and no sane person will ever agree to suicide bombing. I have a question with Brigadier Rana sir, that how do you define drone attacks? Is there a suicide bombing or not?
Sorry, say that again?
Drone attacks, do you define it?
Okay. And the lady here, the last question, the lady here, can you pass on the mic? Okay, you can also have it. Short. Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. My name is Fatima Moin and I'm in the education sector. I don't have a question, but I have a suggestion for the panelists. Dr. Sheila, what she read out of her book was very interesting, and I'd be grateful if you could explain the current situation of Balochistan insurgency to her, because it does not relate to the East Pakistan, West Pakistan. I was a very young child, I don't remember. But I think to get some facts straight, to explain the Baloch element and the Bengali element at this moment to Dr. Sheila, please, later on. Because I think there is some misconception as far as the Baluchi situation is concerned at the moment.
Okay. Any question?
Doctor, my name is Ali Riza. I'm a student of BBA, CBM. My question is to all of the panelists that, number one, what kind of war are we talking about? इस पूरे डिस्कशन में हमने बहुत सारी वॉर्स की बात की है, उसमें 5 से 6 कैटेगरीज ऑफ वॉर्स हमने डिस्कस कर ली हैं. हर एक का सोल्यूशन डिफरेंट है, हर एक की कॉज डिफरेंट है. पहली बात, हम किस वॉर टाइप की बात कर रहे हैं. सेकंड क्वेश्चन इज कि ये जो साइकोलॉजिकल इफेक्ट्स हैं जो हमें आज झगड़े हुए हैं, ये सारे साइकोलॉजिकल इफेक्ट्स हैं, इनकी एक कॉज है वॉर की कॉज द स्ट्रगल ऑफ गेटिंग मिनरल्स टू गेट रिसोर्सेज एंड पावर. अगर हम इस कॉज को खत्म नहीं कर सकते, यानी कि अगर हम वॉर को खत्म नहीं कर सकते, जो कि बहुत मुश्किल काम है, तो हम इन इफेक्ट्स को कैसे खत्म करेंगे? और अगर हम वॉर को रोक सकते हैं तो कैसे?
Thank you. Can you take the mic and gentleman over there? Brief question, please. आप पूछ लीजिए, लेकिन brief रखिएगा.
Rafiq Bengali. I just wanted to ask, suppose that is the psyche going to change in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, what they remember from the 71 war?
Okay.
Did that ever change?
Lady over here.
My question is from Dr. Rana. You spoke about some insurgencies and wars and, with small I that we are a part of. So how can we overcome all these, and do you suggest something to kill all this helplessness and frustration that's always building up, when you see limited resources and when you see these unjust, unfair treatment in society? So do you suggest some activities to come out of that?
Okay. Is there anyone there? Right. Okay, so we have a smattering of questions, some related to the Bangladesh crisis and how does it relate to the Balochi problem now. We have questions of how to cope with hopelessness and helplessness that seems to have pervaded the psyche of the Pakistani population. And we have some questions about how do you define terrorism and what kind of war are we talking about. So perhaps we can just go around and each one of you can take some aspects of the different questions that have come up.
Okay, I think I identified about 3. I would like to address the what can you call terrorism, because this is a very important question in politics and we deal with it all the time. And you can't, it's quite true, we need to define it. One man's terrorist is always another man's freedom fighter. And so, and to strike terror, anyone who strikes terror is, I guess, a terrorist, but it has become very loaded with political connotations. So we need to use the term with care or not use it in certain circumstances. And I leave the rest of the comments. I'm sure the others will have something to say about it as well. About the current, if there was a question about the current situation in Balochistan, and the East Pakistan situation before. I have a great deal of interest in Balochistan. Of course, the Balochistan rebellion has been going on for much longer than, it has begun at the time of Pakistan's birth. And there have been waves of protest and repression in Balochistan. What there is in common is, I don't think it's just in common with what happened in East Pakistan in 71. It's something in common across South Asia, also in India. Anybody who has challenged the nation-state project of these countries has faced immense repression and military action against them. And for example, Balochistan, I feel, is more similar to other cases in India, like in India's northeast, where there are the Nagas or people in Manipur and so on, who have, like the Baluch, challenged their very incorporation into these nation states, India and Pakistan, and have been fighting from the very beginning against that project, and have suffered great repression for 65 years now, and no end in sight. I personally find that a better comparison for Balochistan than East Pakistan, because East Pakistan did not have that accession issue, and there was a strong Muslim League presence there. And it fell out with Pakistan as nation state afterwards. But so in terms of the politics, I think that there are other examples from India which are probably better comparisons for Balochistan. And about the question about whether the psyche will change or not, I don't know is the honest answer, but all I can say is that perhaps, I mean, my humble contribution is to try to open up an frank discussion.
Various communities that they belong to. So hatred is put in or instilled very early, and this insecure mother is totally helpless probably at that point in time. She actually feeds that at a certain level out of her own insecurities. And if you can therefore work at the woman as a unit in a society, I think you will enhance the resilience of the population to terrorism and insurgencies and war. This is the best that one can do probably in terms of intervention. The second issue is that we need to also understand that the terrorist is not a Balochi or a Bengali or a Punjabi or anybody. Terrorist has no nationality, he has no belief system. His real religion is probably to instill distress, fear, take away hope, destroy people's will, and take away the confidence of people in their society. I think that's what a terrorist is. And whoever starts to do that, whether he comes or represents a nation or a party or whoever, should be considered a terrorist. Anybody who starts to do that. And therefore, I think we need to take these labels away from the terrorist belonging to a particular section or a particular part of the world or a particular belief system. And I think the moment we as a society start to alienate the terrorist, I think that's the time when you will start to win the battle against him.
Just I wanted to say, you know, today's terrorist can be tomorrow's hero, like Mandela. So, I mean, in this book, which I have written, I mean, all these things, it's like an academic thing also, so I would like you to read this. Now, for me, as a Pakistani, as a psychiatrist, I'll only focus on Pakistan. I think we are going through hell. We are fighting for sovereignty. Palestine is fighting for liberation. And that's why I find it very interesting, an analogy when I went there. And I feel very strongly the answer to most of the questions, especially to Pakistan's problems. Number one is education. The education in Palestine is, the Gaza especially, 97 to 100, it was 100%. And now it's 97% because people are not sending children to schools because they need some money, and the children can work in labor places, etc., as a labor. So number one is education, and number two, the first and foremost thing I think is to develop a community mental health program. And the community mental health program will cater to women's issues, what Mother Trana talked about, the children's problems, and adolescents and young people. The student from CBM is just talking about, there's so many issues we need to deal with, and only community mental health programs, through community mental health programs, we can educate all these people, contain, treat the sort of psychosocial issues or the the conditions of PTSD, etc., to build resilience and to infuse hope and respect, develop integrity. We have so many issues, and I honestly think the crux of the answer to all this is developing a community mental health program involving different people, the social workers, the educationists, the mothers, the fathers, the whole community, the whole society. So for Pakistan, this is what I feel, and I'm basically focusing myself on Pakistan because I think Pakistan comes first to me.
Yes, I think well said. In Sawat, by the way, it is not extremism. I should have mentioned that. These children don't even know. I mean, extremism means that they have some ideology that they're going against. There's nothing. They were just told, they were trying to get away from a dire life into heaven. And they were promised that if they did that, they would have it. So they would have that dignity, they would have that food, they would have that, be able to have many benefits of Huris in the other world, whereas they had no hope on this. So it has nothing to do with extremism. Terrorism, I don't even want to touch. Uneza is quite right. It's a very complex term, and it is used differently. But in these children, it wasn't. There was no extremism at all. The other factor that I think we should all concentrate on is that in the First World War, only 10% of the casualties were civilians. In the Second World War, it was 25%. Today, it's 80% of civilian casualties in all acts of war and terror and insurgencies. So that means we are all vulnerable. We can't just say we are on this side. We're not. We're right there. We are right at the receiving end.
Thank you very much, Dr. Piracha. It reminds me of a quote by Voltaire, who said that it is forbidden to kill. It is forbidden to kill because all murderers must be punished, except when they kill in large numbers and to the sound of trumpets. And I think this is what is happening as the world progresses, as science and technology progresses. We are coming up with weapons that can vaporize you without you even knowing what has hit you. The drone attacks is only a glimpse of what the future holds, as the great nations of this world are investing in the military-industrial complex. And so when we look at what is happening in the world today, the polarized world, we really need to also raise a voice in pressurizing governments, pressurizing leaders to address some of these basic fundamental issues that are causing into and feeding into terrorism. At the end of the day, I think we are judged as human beings by how we treat other human beings. And it should be done not just at an individual level, at a personal level, what Dr. Rana talked about, with our spouses, our children, our servants, our colleagues, and so on, but also when policies and decisions are made in Washington and London and Tel Aviv and Islamabad and Tehran. And I'm dreading the kind of rhetoric that is being ratcheted up about Tehran and the kind of psychological impact it must be having on the people of Iran at the moment. Who's addressing that? Who's responsible for that? And the kind of weapons that they have, and they're itching to unleash them onto the Irani population, as they did in Libya. And I dread if it was to happen and the fallout will again come into Pakistan, then God help us all. So I think it is imperative, not just at an individual level, but at all levels of the highest decision-making power, that we remember when we make decisions of going to war or sanctioning subversion or assassination or drone attacks, the kind of psychological impact that it will have on the population, the civilians, which, as Dr. Faria has mentioned, has now civilian casualties are now 80%. So I'd like to thank you all for attending this session. It's surprising so few have left the room. It's a measure of the quality of the discussion and the panelists that have been there. And thank you very much for coming.